good evening and a very warm welcome to all of you for the first of this term's Thinking About webinars. My name is James Wisson, I'm Head of Economics at Dulwich College, and it's a real pleasure to introduce Emily McKenzie today, who will be speaking to us about the economics of biodiversity. Now, Emily has experience of working in over 25 different countries during a distinguished career as an environmental economist. These experiences range from several years in Melanesia, working on natural resource policy across the South Pacific, and also include a period as the World Wildlife Fund's Chief Advisor on Economics and Sustainability. Currently, Emily's working for the UK government in the Treasury, where she's leading a team which has worked on the substance of the Dasgupta Review on the Economics of Biodiversity and its policy recommendations. For too long, economics has imagined that humanity is somehow external to nature, but in a world where many researchers and scientists talk about a climate crisis, and where we can link the emergence of new viruses and diseases like COVID-19 to humanity's destruction of biodiversity, it has never been more important to confront the reality that our economies and societies are embedded within the natural world. Emily and her colleagues do exactly this, and so I'm absolutely delighted to introduce Emily to you all today to learn more about this hugely important area. Emily.
Thank you very much, and I will share my presentation. I hope you're now seeing that clearly. Is that okay? Great. So good afternoon, and thank you very much for inviting me to be here today. It's a real pleasure to speak with you all. First of all, my husband's a head teacher, I dread to say. So I've for many years been visiting his school to talk about environmental issues and conservation. And I have to say, of all the people I've spoke to, I found the sessions with schools and young people have been some of the most interesting and also the most challenging questions. So I'm really looking forward to hearing your thoughts and your questions today. And also because education and the role of all of us as citizens is one of the major themes in the Dasgupta Review. And to leap right to the end of my talk, Partha, Professor Dasgupta, who led this review, argues that every child in every country is owed the teaching of natural history, to be introduced to the awe and wonder of the natural world and understanding how it contributes to all our lives and supports our economies. So I'm really excited. It's the first, we've been doing outreach about the review for a couple of months now. It's the first session I've done with schools. So really looking forward to today. So yeah, my name is Emily McKenzie. I'll be talking to you about this review, which was published in early February of this year. And as Dr. Wisson said, the review is important because in my experience, engaging economists in particular and economic and financial decision makers is going to be absolutely essential to tackle the crisis of biodiversity loss. Indeed, biodiversity loss is an economic and financial issue, and it poses economic and financial risks. And economics as a discipline and as a way of thinking offers many useful tools and concepts to address the problem. So today I'll give a presentation of about 25 minutes, and I hope to give you a deeper understanding of the review, instill in you the belief that it makes a really useful contribution, not only to understanding economics, but to all of our lives and our choices. I'll cover the review's framework, and I'll cover it in its main recommendations, what we call its options for change. And I'm hoping after this presentation, you'll share what you've learned in the webinar with friends and teachers and family and have a broader discussion. And I'd always love to hear back from you. At the end, I'll put our email address up, but about what you heard thought was useful and new, or what you hadn't thought about in that way, its relevance to you. So please do stay in touch afterwards. And do read the review itself. So I'll try to do justice in the webinar, but it's the full review is a 600-page report. There are shorter versions. I know you'll be encouraged to hear. Sure, you have lots of reading. An abridged version of about 100 pages and a short, very short, sort of 5-page headline messages document. So do pick it up and have a read to get into it, and stay in touch as you get deeper into the material. So before I dive in, just as a bit of a preamble, I just want to stress that what I'm presenting doesn't represent the view of the UK Treasury or the government, although I've been based there. I'm presenting today here in a role I have in an independent review. So I'm reflecting that independent viewpoint. So, hold on. There we go. I hope, please shout if you're not seeing the second slide. Hopefully you are now seeing that smooth switch from one slide to the other. So many studies before the review happened, many studies had already made clear the extent and speed of biodiversity loss and how these losses are posing risks to all of us, to our economies and our well-being. But these economic consequences have often they're still overlooked and often misunderstood. And that's why back in the spring of 2019, the UK Chancellor, so the head of our Treasury, the head of our Economics and Finance Ministry, commissioned a global independent review on the economics of biodiversity. So in the government, you can commission a government review, which can have political influence, or an independent review, which is requested by the government, but is then independent of any kind of political influence. So this is a truly independent review commissioned by the Treasury. It was led by Professor Sir Partha Dasgupta, who's an emeritus professor of economics at the University of Cambridge. He's had a long career, more than 45 years, working as a very deep, very credible economist, but also thinking about across many related disciplines, from demography to philosophy, that we touch on in the review. So it's been a real privilege for me to learn from and work with him. And in a nutshell, what the review does is explore the sustainability of how we as humans are engaging with the natural world. And it tries to provide a comprehensive framework for thinking about biodiversity that's a credible economic framework, but also grounded in a really deep understanding of ecology. So how ecosystems, the sort of networks of living stuff out there, how they're affected by economic activity, and how our activities in the same way depend on those same ecosystems. So that's a little bit of context to what it was and how it came about and why it was instigated. So the framework itself, at its core, the review sees biodiversity loss as an asset, what we call an asset management problem. So nature is an asset, just like produced capital, things like roads or buildings, our assets, or human capital, our skills that you're getting through your education, or our health are assets. Those ideas of those things as assets pretty well sort of accepted. But natural assets on natural systems also produce a flow of goods and services over time. So we rely on nature to provide us with very important, vital, tangible things like food, water, shelter. Also less tangible things, but absolutely essential, regulating our climate. So discussions about climate change are now more central. Also controlling disease, which is obviously top of mind with COVID-19, and maintaining nutrient cycles that support our food system, or providing oxygen on which we couldn't breathe, without which we couldn't breathe. So very essential stuff, all the way through to more ephemeral but no less sort of fundamental things like spiritual fulfillment, opportunities for recreation, and so on. So nature is an asset, and then we think of biodiversity. So what's biodiversity? Nature's the asset. Biodiversity as the diversity of those assets. So biodiversity is the diversity of species, of ecosystems, and of genes in our living systems. And biodiversity is an essential characteristic of nature that makes ecosystems. So we know from the science that ecosystems that are more diverse are more productive in giving us all these services we rely on. They're more resilient and able to adapt to change. So in the review, we use a sort of a financial analogy, just as diversity within a financial portfolio, for those of you who know about finance, would reduce the risk and uncertainty in your financial returns. Greater biodiversity reduces risks and uncertainty within our portfolio of natural assets. And these analogies have been important to us in the review because one of our main audiences is economic and finance decision makers. And then finally, thinking of nature as an asset means recognizing that all of us are managing these assets. Like when I go and decide whether to grow more flowers in my garden or build my pond, through all the way to the government who's deciding what to invest in their budget, through to businesses deciding how to manage the land they own, or they are influencing through their supply chains. We're all asset managers. We might not be thinking about it consciously, but all our decisions are determining this mix of natural, human, and produced capital. So we all are playing a part. So the review argues, unfortunately, that there's evidence we've collectively failed to manage this portfolio of assets well. So these, what I'm showing you here, are what are called global capital accounts, which show the extent of this mismanagement. So this chart you're seeing is showing from the United Nations Environment Programme, produces an inclusive wealth report every couple of years. So this is showing estimates of what we call accounting values, trying to get the true values of these three types of asset capital goods: produced, human, and natural capital, since the early 1990s. And you can see that globally produced capital per head since early 1990s has doubled, and human capital per head has also increased by about 13%. But the value of our natural capital has declined by nearly 40%. And this is probably a vast underestimate because we're not able to measure everything. So even though it's well understood we wouldn't run down the stock of produced capital to the point of depletion in say in a treasury or economics and finance ministry in another country, because that would reduce your economy's productive capabilities, we haven't internalized that in thinking about nature. And I'll show later some data that shows that we're running down our natural capital, things like our forests, our mangroves, our coral reefs, our grasslands, in some cases to the point of them collapsing. So, and one of the things I found really powerful for those of you who like history is that Professor Dasgupta has taken the review really to be informed by our historical experience. The first chapter begins with the beginning of time, which I just love, on deep history. But in particular, we look at this period, in particular since 1950, sort of shortly after World War II. So, and in that 70 years, recognizing that that recent history has in many ways been the best of times, not to be naive about it, we have prospered at an unprecedented rate. The global population has grown, life expectancy has doubled. The average person in the world enjoys a far higher income, less likely to live in absolute poverty, and lives significantly longer than at any time in human history. So we're doing well, we're in the best of times. And you can see on the left, in the left-hand chart, the exponential rise in real gross domestic product, so GDP, which measures economic activity that's happened globally. So since 1950, global economic output, as we've had all of these increases in all these things about living standards, has increased about 15-fold. And that's where we get to the rub. So it's the best of times, but the way in which we've achieved this prosperity, because we've been running down nature to do so, means it's also come at its expense. And this means we're simultaneously living in the worst of times. So I don't know how familiar you are with the figures. They can be so terrifying as to make you switch off. But biodiversity is declining faster than at any time in history. Current extinction rates are around 100 to 1,000 times higher than average over the past several million years, and those rates are accelerating. And what you can see, I mean, not to overemphasize any one figure, but the chart on the right shows something called the Living Planet Index, which tracks the abundance of mammals and birds and fish and reptiles and amphibians. And you can see here, between 1970 and 2016, the population of species fell on average by nearly 70%, which is extraordinary. And when I mentioned all these benefits, these services we get from the environment, there's been another global assessment that showed that 14 out of the 18 services we benefit from are declining. So the best and the worst of times. And in the review we show, or we argue, I guess, the kind of, and I won't dwell too much on the theory, it goes very deeply into the theory, but this widespread rapid environmental degradation is what we call due to a demand-supply imbalance, talking in economic terms. So we have this central part of our framework we call the impact equation. So the review asserts that for at least several decades, this equation, which you can see in the center of the planet, has been an inequality. And an inequality meaning that demand on the left-hand side is greater than nature's supply. So our demands on nature for all its services have been greater than what nature can handle to keep supplying us on a sustainable basis. So we're putting demands by extracting resources for food, fish out of the sea, crops out of the land. But then we're also putting our waste back into the planet through carbon emissions, through pollution, and so on. So I will just break this down a little bit, because the framework here helps to generate our recommendations. So our demands on nature are determined first by the size and composition of how much demand each of us as an individual is making on nature. And that's little y. You can proxy that by GDP per capita, sort of a proxy of our economic activity. But then it's also the number of people on the planet who are making those demands. So the total population of the world. So here we're thinking globally, that's capital N. And then also the efficiency with which we're converting nature's services to meet all of our needs and to return our waste back into the planet, and that's alpha. So to manage our demands, which at the moment are vastly outstripping supply, we can reduce our individual activity, we can reduce the number of people making that putting those pressures on, or we can try to get more efficient in the way we do it so it's less damaging. And on the right-hand side, that represents nature's supply. So that's really a function of the overall stock of natural assets, or how many ecosystems have we got and how healthy are they? And also its ability to regenerate, which is S. So nature is an extraordinary thing. It's different actually from produced capital like a road, because if you leave nature alone, it regenerates itself, it grows. You know, I plant my flowers, they keep flourishing. And this is, I know it may seem quite technical, but I think it's a really powerful framework because it provides a condition for truly sustainable development, which is bringing our demands on nature back in line with supply. We have to turn this inequality into an equality. We can't go on forever with our demands being greater than supply. As you can see on the planet, the water's running out. And I'll get to why that matters in a moment. So, one of the reasons it matters, this sort of persistent overshoot in our demands, it's endangering the prosperity of current and future generations. We're running down our natural assets, to go back to the original framing. We're running down the biodiversity that allows our nature to be productive and resilient. And this is fueling significant risk and uncertainty for all of us. And I think the situation with COVID-19, which Dr. Wilson mentioned at the beginning, so there are strong links between the emergence of COVID-19 and land use change with deforestation and also the illegal wildlife trade. So there's a strong links between disease outbreaks. It's just one obviously very clear current manifestation of these risks, but there are many others. And this comes down to having a really deep understanding of ecology and the kind of the processes of our natural world, of our ecosystems. So the way Professor Dasgupta would describe these is what we call non-linear. Now, what does that mean? It means if you were to break an ecosystem up like a forest into smaller parts by putting huge highways that cut across it, the sum of the components, what the little individual now cut up pieces can do is much less than the sum of the previous whole, because ecosystems are connected. And related to this, we know that ecosystems have what are called tipping points, so they can shift to different stable states. A really obvious example of this is a lake, which can shift from a healthy state to an unhealthy state when it's polluted. And similarly, slightly more, I guess, alarmingly, at a global scale, if the Amazon rainforest, which could tip from a tropical rainforest to a grassland, were to do so, it would have huge consequences for the water cycle globally. So there are these tipping points that we know can lead to systems that are poorer, less productive, going to be less good for all of us, let alone the animals that live there. We also know that these changes can be rapid. They can be very hard to predict, and they can have far-reaching effects. So all of this is worrying, and some analysis we did in the review also suggests that low-income countries stand to lose the most we looked at modelling 3 different tipping points in forests, in fisheries, and in pollinators who pollinate our crops like bees. So also particularly worrying for developing countries. So all of this kind of leads to an argument that conservation of nature, all else equal, is preferable to restoration, because we want to keep our options open. We don't want to lose what we've got, and we're not quite sure what the consequences might be. So so that's kind of the problem statement, how we conceptualize the problem. But why is it happening? So in the review, we highlight these 3 features of the natural world. It's mobile, so Professor Dasgupta speaks about this very poetically, you know, fish swim and the winds blow, everything's on the move. And also much of nature is silent and invisible. So notably, extraordinary amounts of biodiversity in the soils beneath our feet. And so because of this, because it's mobile, silent and invisible, it's very difficult or in some cases impossible to kind of comprehensively record how we're using nature and how we're affecting it. And this leads to what we call in economics, for those of you who study economics, sort of widespread externalities, where the impacts of our actions on others we're not taking into account. So if I'm messing up my natural system down the road, I'm not necessarily thinking about all the other people who like to go and visit it as a park. And so, yeah, and also much of the natural world is open to all of us at no monetary charge. It doesn't charge us as a bill. So the true worth, the true value to all of us from nature of all these services are not reflected in the prices we serve. So if a business is going to use pollinators, let's say a farm or agriculture business is benefiting from bees pollinating crops without, you know, investing necessarily in nature to keep those bees thriving. And it's these pricing distortions, the fact that our markets aren't reflecting all these benefits, that have led us to that alarming chart I showed early on, where we're underinvesting in our natural assets. And so, yeah, we need to fix this. And this is a bit of jargon on the slide, but we portray it in the review as an institutional failure, not just a market failure. What does that really mean? It means that we're not creating the institutions to fix the problem. For example, governments continue to pay more to people to exploit nature than to protect it. And we also are lacking institutions globally to pay for what we call global public goods, things that are out there that benefit all of us, like the ocean or the world's rainforests. So the institutions themselves are not sufficient. Sorry, gone a bit far here. So yeah, what do we mean by institutions? So these are the rules and arrangements that govern our undertakings. They can vary from households and markets all the way through to governments and nation states, through to international organizations. And the review in particular looks at the importance of community-based management. There's a lot of evidence that community-based management of ecosystems, where you have NGOs and communities working, are really important. That's because they understand their ecosystems best, and they share knowledge. But actually, you need to have really clear trust, cooperation, and clear rules of engagement. And the most effective institutions be one where you can follow if people, you can verify and observe if people are following the rules, and penalize them if they don't. And we look in the review as to why that's difficult, but the importance of creating these kind of effective institutions as the building blocks of better ways of organizing ourselves. So one of the most sort of powerful ideas in the review starts from understanding, and it might sound like it is a very simple truth, and why on earth we haven't thought about this all along, but that the global economy is embedded in nature. The biosphere is what we talk about, which is basically the global ecosystem. So we are obviously part of that, it's our home. But perhaps surprisingly, this view, although it might seem obvious to you, contrasts with what standard macroeconomic models have conceptualized, which might make sense because those models were developed when nature was still plentiful, coming out of World War II. You had high unemployment, plentiful nature. But standard models view all of us as kind of external to nature, like we're dipping in like a fisherman who dips into a pond. We take out the fish, we put the waste back in, and then we can leave unaffected by the fact that there are fewer fish and we might have done some pollution. But in reality, when you think about how those models work, we can't leave the planet. It's our home. Although I have been asked by somebody whether we could move to Mars. I think they were genuine. But the review argues that although this might seem quite conceptual, viewing our economy as embedded within the biosphere is really important. If you don't, it encourages this view, and we show why, that technology and human ingenuity can always fix the problem. We can continue to raise global output indefinitely without affecting the planet so adversely that it might be tipped into a regime we're not going to benefit from. So if you want to get more into it, you can read the review. We build up an alternative way of thinking about the economy as embedded, how we rely on natural resources, how we rely on the planet and how it affects it to be putting our waste back in, and what that means for how we think about economic possibilities. In a fundamental way, it raises this idea that the economy, because nature is bounded, because our planet is bounded by the laws of physics, the global economy is also bounded. In the long run, we don't know exactly when, there's some maximum sustainable level of GDP. And so it reshapes our understanding of what sustainable economic development and growth really looks like. And even though these bounds might not yet be completely binding, what we're seeing from the data is that we're pushing our ecosystems towards these tipping points. And so it's becoming increasingly urgent that we act and think in a different way. So I'll skip through this just to so we have plenty of time for discussion. So just to conclude, I want to give you a brief overview of what the review recommends. So now you've got a better understanding of the problem, how to think about it, why it's come about. So what should we do? So the review recommends that sustainable economic growth and development requires us to take a different path than the one we've been on, where our engagements with nature are not only sustainable, but that's going to enhance our collective wealth and well-being and that of our descendants, of our children. So it proposes these three broad transitions. The first is, if you remember this impact inequality, so shift that to inequality. So that means increasing nature's supply relative to its current level and reducing our demands. I'll go through each of these in turn in a moment. The second is to change how we measure economic success, because our current measures are not putting us on a sustainable path. And the third is to transform our institutions and our systems to enable all of this to happen. So in this slide gives a few, some of the actual specific recommendations we highlight in each of these buckets. So in this first one, what do we mean? Well, on nature's supply, we're talking about conservation and restoration, things like protected areas and restoring forests, peatlands, and so on. Also, it doesn't always mean you can't go there. So also having better management of the land and sea in a way that benefits both nature and people. So things like more sustainable agriculture, more sustainable fisheries, where we're working in harmony with nature. So that's on the supply side, and boosting nature's supply. On the demand side, it's about, again, if you go back to that impact equation I showed, reducing our demand, so more sustainable consumption and production, and having transparency along entire supply chains about how they impact and depend on nature. So when you buy a product at the supermarket, where has it come from and what damage has been done? And there are certification schemes and some work on that transparency. But then also in sort of the demographic transition, so managing that through better access to community-based family planning and reproductive health in countries where there's unmet need for those. And finally, on efficiency. So the review emphasizes that technology is not going to solve all the problems of the world. We shouldn't hang put all our eggs in the technology basket, but technology still has a role. I mean, we give examples from the food system where technologies, things like precision agriculture, genetic engineering can help improve our efficiency and do less damage. In the second bucket around measuring success, while the review recognizes that GDP, which is a very prevalent measure, it's indispensable for short-run macroeconomic analysis, it significantly misleads if it's used to assess social well-being or sustainable prosperity. So the review argues governments, all of us, should be moving towards an inclusive measure of wealth as our standard measure of economic success. So this would be a measure of the true accounting values of not only produced and human capital, but also natural capital. And in order to do this, work on natural capital accounting, so measuring our nature, valuing it, is kind of a building block to make that happen. I'm happy to talk about any of this in the discussion in more detail. And then also our productivity measures. So now that I'm working in the Treasury, I can see that measures of productivity also drive a lot of policy. But at the moment, because productivity measures are based on these models, which I talked about earlier, are kind of misleading, environmental degradation can be misinterpreted, that we're getting cleverer, increased knowledge, better institutions, when actually what we're really seeing is losing our natural world. And then the very final bucket is around institutions. So this is obviously very broad and there's a lot in here, but in particular, the review emphasizes finance and education systems. So on finance, the review shows that it emphasizes the importance that both public and private finance, and I think I heard you had a talk on green finance recently, need to be reoriented. So away from activities that are harming nature and unsustainable towards those that are good. And we give some data on the huge difference actually. So about 4 to 6 trillion per year is going to perverse subsidies that damage nature globally, whereas it's only, I'm forgetting the statistics, but sort of in the hundreds of billions that's going to conservation, restoration of ecosystems. But then to conclude, which seems appropriate with all of you on education, the review concludes that because we can never fully observe and verify, even if we had a perfect world where we're building all these institutions with the right rules, we'd never be able to observe and verify that we're all doing what we're told. And so ultimately, it's going to come down to all of us to have a judgment on our own behaviours. And so, and we also look at evidence about children becoming more distant from nature, all of us becoming more distant from nature, even in our working worlds. So reforming our education systems, including how we teach economics, but actually across the whole syllabus, to understand nature, as I said at the beginning, how inspiring it is, how we depend on all of it, all the way from early years through to higher education is vital. So that's the kind of the final conclusion of the review. So I won't go through these as the again, because I think we've now talked about it, and I'd like to go to the discussion. So I will stop sharing my slides, and hopefully you heard all of that clearly. Over to you guys. I'm looking forward to hear your questions.
Thank you so much, Emily, for the really interesting presentation. It was really informative, and I think the review gives a really good idea about like the way forward in our future. So we're going to move on to the questions now. So if you have any questions, feel free to put it in the Q&A section. So I would like to know, do you think there are any problems in presenting like the oversimplified idea of nature as standardized or maybe like a commodity?
Great, thanks, Geneva. Yeah, it's been interesting to see that's one of the main reactions we've had since we've published. So I think there's a distinction here between how you think about the issue and then what policies it leads you to. So I think Professor Dasgupta and I agree with him, don't see. So if you only look at this through a kind of instrumental framework, how do we benefit from nature? It's obviously too narrow. But even looking through that lens, we can see we're doing stuff that's against our own interests. So I think that's a help, and that's not being recognized. So we recognize it's too narrow a framework, but in itself it's powerful for reaching people who are thinking in that way. There's a lot of the review that reflects that nature is in many cases has intrinsic value beyond all of us as humans. In many cases, it's sacred for religious or spiritual reasons. And in fact, half the chapter on valuation looks at these deep philosophical perspectives of meaning, of philosophy, of your sense of self and how we're connected to nature. So I think the review's been misconstrued when people have said this has a very narrow conception. But I still, I've devoted my career working in environmental economics because I think these arguments are needed to move the agenda forward, and they're not mutually exclusive. That's what I really love about the way Partha has portrayed things. They're not mutually exclusive. You can recognize it's an asset and you can also recognize it's sacred. And in many cases, then if you get to what does that lead you in terms of policy recommendations? Actually, again, what I have loved and learned from working with Partha is that this way of thinking leads you to policy recommendations that typically would be thought of as recommended by ecologists, like protected areas. So what Partha would say is we can see we're risking these tipping points. We're getting closer to them. In fact, at local scales, we're already seeing them. We're seeing mass, degradation of soils. We're seeing dead zones out in marine areas. Now, when you get, even if you take just a really robust economic frame, when you get close to those tipping points, you don't keep using, and you use the term commodification, you wouldn't use a pricing mechanism. You would outright regulate. you would say, if we're running a risk of a major tipping point, we're just not going to go there. So it leads you, it's like an economic framework grounded in ecology that leads you to recommendations of protected areas, no-go zones, which is very interesting and powerful. So it doesn't lead you, I think commodification as a phrase implies pricing, selling, market, payments. Now, we cover payments for ecosystem services and these market mechanisms, but they're one of many others. And in fact, the much greater emphasis is on this kind of risk-based approach. So you've asked the question that has come up most powerfully in response to the review, but I would say when you get under the skin of the review and you really read it, you can see it delves really quite deeply into the topic. It's a great question.
Thank you again, Emily, for the talk. So another question we have is, as we begin our recovery from the coronavirus outbreak, how do we convince decision makers in government and in business that limiting the destruction of biodiversity is more important or as important as economic recovery?
Yeah. It's really, I don't know. It's the $1 million question. It's what I'm wrestling with right now. I think the review in itself is trying to make a step in that direction, right? So I guess the easy answer is conceptualizing this in a way that speaks to economic and finance decision making. Economics as a discipline is an obvious step I've devoted my career to taking, and been really lucky to work with Professor Dasgupta on this review, which I think is a sort of milestone in that direction. But that obviously is not enough. And I think what was really interesting in discussion, and maybe for all of you, when we first started the review, this debate that happened between us as a team and Professor Dasgupta. So us as a team, like, well, we're commissioned by the Treasury, we need to speak to economic and finance decision makers, we need to speak to, economic and finance ministries and business, because they're the sort of powerhouses and that's what will change the world. And he would always say, no, we speak to the citizen. Everyone is a citizen. Ultimately, this is an issue for all of us. We're going to speak to the whole world, including the citizen in every person, whether they're the head of government or head of a business, but also all of us in how we make choices. And ultimately, I think that's about recognizing we all have to make our own choices and we have to hold our institutions to account. Where do you invest your savings? How do you hold when you get to the working world? Where do your pensions go? What do you buy? What do you choose to eat? How do you make your purchasing choices? How many children do you choose to have? What do you choose to work in? What are your career choices? But holding our governments to account, who you choose to vote in, how you choose your politicians. I mean, that's something that should speak to all of you. So you can read the review in a conceptual way. You can read it as a treasury, but you can also read it as an individual, as a sort of roadmap for what all of us need to do in our personal choices. I guess I'm learning, about the political environment. So the government is welcomed the review and is kind of looking through it and will respond in due course. So, the dynamics of this will be interesting to see how they play out and how all of you sort of see it as your future and how you want to hold your businesses and governments to account.
Okay, thank you. And another question. I've read some of the review, and one of the things it talks about is, rather than calculating GDP to measure economic growth, they use inclusive wealth. So would you mind expanding on that, and if you think the pros and cons of doing that?
Yeah, sure. So I think Partha, one of the things that he brings is a really beautiful, deep theoretical perspective on economics. He's an incredible mathematician, but also an incredible philosopher. And so what he's shown with inclusive wealth is that, and this comes from work he did much earlier, is a theorem that shows that if you have an inclusive measure of wealth, which is the discounted social value of these three types of capital measured properly, it actually is proven as a theorem that it moves in lockstep with the social well-being across generations. So it's a measure of inclusive wealth, not because we only care about wealth and money, because we care about well-being. And so if we're measuring our wealth, we're measuring the stocks of our assets, and how they change over time, then we'll be having a proxy for well-being. How this really, I find it very helpful to think about how this works in practice. So it works in practice in two ways. One is if you're choosing, so the Treasury, for example, where I'm now based, or any government department, you're choosing between different policies. What should we do? You typically apply something called the Green Book, which is like a policy analysis tool. And in there, you'd use the discounted net present value of the different policies. And in fact, just a couple of years ago, they added nature and natural capital into that. So we're actually in the UK quite good at looking at this kind of framework. How would our natural and other forms of capital be affected, and the flows of services they provide us, by different policies, and then choosing those policies on the basis of that. The guidance is there. The problem is it's not necessarily, it's actually evidence is not being widely used. So there's an accountability and a capacity gap in actually using it in policy appraisal. But we in the UK have very good guidance since 2018. But departments aren't necessarily using it because they don't feel they have to, they don't feel they need to, or they don't feel able to. So that's kind of a big focus for me now, is thinking about those barriers. So that's choosing between different policies at a point in time. But you can also think about inclusive wealth, about how's your economy progressing over time. And right now, listen to the radio, watch the telly, it's all about GDP. And I suppose the clear message is GDP gives you the wrong signals. It's income, it's not your stock of assets. You wouldn't try to massively increase your income while running down everything in the bank so you've got nothing left. Similarly, we shouldn't be doing that. And so that leads you to tracking natural capital alongside human and produced capital over time in an economy. And we do have natural capital accounts in the UK. There've been a lot of progress with that too. But again, they're not being widely used in policy. And so the question is, how do you improve on those natural capital accounts? How do you make progress on that agenda over time in a holistic way, so we can see if the path of an economy is sustainable over time, as well as picking policies that are the best at a point in time, if that makes sense.
So another
question. It's probably, yeah, Lorenzo, thank you.
Go on.
No. Go to another question.
Question we have is, how can we ensure that policymakers are actually collaborating with global political leaders, and so that they start shaping policies accordingly?
Yes, so it's actually a really interesting year to be working on this, and the review itself is timed quite nicely for discussions with international organizations. So this year, 2021, is a critical year. We have 2 global conventions. There's something called the Convention on Biological Diversity, which will have its 15th, what we call Conference of the Parties, I think in October. It's been delayed in Kunming in China. So that will set long-term targets for addressing biodiversity. So we've been engaging with the CBD Secretariat and other countries on the review. But then there's also the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, and there the UK government is co-hosting in Glasgow that meeting in November. So although that focuses on climate change, nature, and what we call nature-based solutions for climate change, so for example using forests to sequester and store carbon, that's going to be a prominent theme at that meeting. So those are 2 important areas where the UK government will be making sure that nature and these issues in the review are discussed. We're also presidents this year of the G7 countries. So that also enables us to be having a dialogue with G7 countries and shaping the agenda throughout this year to get nature onto the various tracks, you have finance track and leaders track and so on. This is a way of shaping the dialogue. So these create a lot of opportunities actually to be raising what's in the review with other countries, which is exciting.
Okay, this is a question from the Q&A box. One attendee asks, do you think that heavily monitored command economy is the only way to control global usage of natural resources?
Oh gosh, it's a big question. I don't think so. I don't know that much about it, but I think if you want to listen in, I think Partha did a session, maybe hosted by he's been doing a lot of outreach. If you get excited, just listen to some of his sessions because he's more eloquent and understands things deeper than I do. But I think it was the Natural History Museum, and the title was is capitalism the problem? So to come back, is command and control the solution? And I didn't listen to the whole session. Partha did speak about evidence that the Soviet Union at the time, other sort of command and control economies have been no better at this. So there's no one sort of this political model work, this political model won't. It's quite a nuanced perspective. There are obviously ways where market mechanisms can help create efficiency. I think one of the takeaways from the review, though, is that having what we call these quantity constraints, these sort of limits to what we're pushing nature to, is in our interests. But you can still have market mechanisms and achieve that. So, for example, we talk about the New Zealand tradable permit scheme, which enables you to trade permits for fishing, but they set an absolute limit on how many fish can be taken out of New Zealand's waters, and then you trade quotas. So there you can still have, it's a sort of a mixed approach with regulation, but also market mechanisms for efficiency. So I think my answer is no, but there's probably some things to learn from command and control economies.
Another question we have from the floor is, how would you handle homelessness as it has a large negative impact on natural resources and land?
Gosh, that's a great question. I've never been asked that one about before. I don't know, I have to think about that. I mean, underlying the review is the idea of property rights, and so homelessness is a manifestation of a bigger issue of whether people are disenfranchised from the land, from nature, and feel a sense of if they invest in it, will they benefit from it? So I know this is something I can speak about that is slightly related. I think one of the most powerful stories I know, which actually comes from my previous work at WWF, is from Namibia, where they changed the rules in Namibia to enable what they would call communal conservancies. So nature was being massively depleted in Namibia. And then they set up these conservancies which allowed local communities to benefit from wildlife through, for example, ecotourism. And they've seen an incredibly encouraging resurgence of wildlife throughout Namibia. I can't wait to be able to go there because they have, they benefit from wildlife flourishing, and they're invested in it. So I know that seems slightly tangential to homelessness, but if people have a benefit from nature, I think we're more likely to see good outcomes in these sorts of areas. I'll reflect more on that.
Ellie asks, what can we do on an individual basis to help sustain biodiversity?
What can we do on an individual basis? Oh gosh, well, I've had some epiphanies working. I've worked on environment all my career, and I've worked at WWF for 10 years, and so I should have been doing much of this before, but I have, maybe it's age and having children, but I think it's also partly doing the review. I felt this cognitive dissonance that I needed to make my own individual choices, and so I've made my own choices. These aren't specific to the review, but around how much meat I eat, moving more to a vegetarian diet. I have shifted to a more sustainable bank. I have looked into how to make my choices in terms of my, not that I have huge amounts, but in my financing and my personal choices. So, and I think the idea of supply chains is really powerful. So understanding more about what I purchase and where things have come from to try to reduce my own footprint has been powerful for me. That's just speaking about me as a person, as an individual, but influenced also by the thinking of the review. Career choices are interesting. I guess you guys will be getting to those. Can do lots of interesting and impactful and rewarding and well-paid jobs.
Another attendee has asked, what policies would you recommend the government put in place?
So this is where I have two different hats, so it's a little awkward for me because although I work in the government, I'm working this independent review, so I can only talk about what the review recommends. But if I dig in a little bit more to what those recommendations were that I put up on the screen in the sort of second half of their review, presentation. I think that the bundle that it puts together around better measures of success is going to be really important. Conservation and restoration, sustainable consumption and production, and education and finance. These are the buckets, and I think they're really good. They're really good ones. As I don't know if I said this already, but the government itself has welcomed the review, reflecting on the findings, and will be doing a formal response in due course. So that's where the UK government, with my government hat on, will be sort of setting out the policies that it, as an initial step, it sees as responding to the review. So yeah, that will be good to look out for and reflect on when that gets published.
And what has your career path been? You said that you worked at WWF for 10 years. So like from A levels to where you are now, what's your journey?
Yeah. So I studied economics at A level along, I guess I was curious about, I found it appealing as a way of thinking about problems and interrogating problems. I liked the structure of it. I was interested in how it applied to many different areas. But then, so I studied economics then in my degree at Cambridge, and I then went on to do what's called the Overseas Development Institute Fellowship Scheme. For those of you who studied economics, it supports economists to go and work overseas for 2 years in developing countries where they've identified an economics capacity gap. And I had requested to work in environment. You don't always get what you request, but I did end up in a agency in Fiji, which was amazing. Working in the South Pacific as a sort of advisor on environmental economics. So then I got to see government agencies in the Southern Hemisphere doing this kind of policy. Then I moved back to what's called the Joint Nature Conservation Committee here in the UK, which is a government agency, again, setting up an environmental economics team. So that helped me see economics as a powerful way of thinking. It can improve environmental and other policies. Then I moved to WWF for 10 years. I loved working for WWF, so working in an NGO, informing and influencing work on natural capital and working with business, finance and governments. But then I guess 3 years ago, I realized I had a lot to learn about the science policy interface. How does this evidence get used in decision making? And I wanted to go to the heart of how policy gets made. So I spent a year in the Department for Environment building this new environmental land management scheme, which with Brexit, we have an opportunity to come out for common agricultural policy and we spend 3 billion at the moment on the common agricultural policy, which will be sort of thinking how can we better use money for environmental outcomes. And now since then, the Treasury. So I've always been an environmental economist. I love economics, and I think it has a lot to offer for environment. And it's been a mix of sort of government, NGO work, although sort of a bit from the outside, but I've been privileged to work in partnerships with some businesses like the Coca-Cola company, which had a partnership with WWF, or finance, like Guggenheim Partners was a private equity organization, to sort of understand how different organizations think about this problem. So it's been a great career, and I'm sure with the climate change agenda and biodiversity agenda growing, there are going to be many, many more jobs in this space.
We might have time quickly for one last question. So an attendee has asked, do you think putting a monetary value on nature would increase people's awareness of its value, but not to allow it to be exploited by just the rich?
Yeah, I've really wrestled with this question. Because as economists, we've spent a lot of time developing these valuation techniques to estimate the value of things that don't have a market price. And I think those techniques can be helpful, and in some circumstances they can be very convincing. So I've spent much of my career doing monetary valuation, and I think it can be powerful, especially in cost benefit analysis. It can help to make the case, but I think it has to be done with realism about how important it really is. It's not the be all and end all. You can get a lot of progress looking at just biophysical indicators, the amount of fish that you're able to catch, not just the value of that fish, the amount of food you're able to get from the land. You know, you don't have to put everything in monetary terms. And that was also, I think I've learned that from my own experience, but also from hearing from other decision makers, that sometimes health statistics are more interesting to them, like what's the risk, the disease risk, or the malaria risk, or the nutritional risk from the depletion of environment is more interesting than putting everything in value terms. So I think multiple metrics can be useful, but thinking of nature as an asset, as I began, is sort of the fundamental thing that has to underlie those multiple metrics.
Thank you again, Emily, for the really interesting talk. And thank you, Dr. Wisson and Ms. Beretta, for organising this event. Just a reminder to all participants that next week there's going to be a talk on dystopian fantasy. But other than that, thank you all for attending and asking great questions.
Thank you very much, Geneva and Lorenzo and everyone. It's great to meet you and stay in touch.